"You need a wife, and I need a dad," said the little girl to the giant cowboy, and he turned to the single mom in tears. Sable Ridge, Montana Territory, autumn 1877. Morning fog blanketed the ridges like a ghost draped over the bones of the earth. Pines stood tall and silent, sentries to a land that had seen more blood than rain. Far below, the thistle-choked thickets of the prairie rustled gently beneath the hoofbeats of a lone rider. Jackson Clay rode slow, the kind of slow that came from not needing to be anywhere or not caring if you ever got there. He was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered, coat dusted in dried trail mud, hat pulled low over eyes that had seen too much. The brown gelding beneath him moved with quiet respect, as if the horse, too, knew to keep its thoughts to itself. He followed no path, just instinct and memory, the smell of cedar smoke long gone but somehow still clinging to his senses. The town of Sable Ridge lay 5 miles west, but he rarely ventured in unless the supply list outweighed his dread of conversation. As he passed a cluster of weathered rocks near the ravine, a sound cut through the silence, thin, trembling, and utterly human. A child's cry. Jackson reined in hard. His horse snorted, ears twitching. He dismounted, boots landing heavy in the dewy grass. The cry came again, faint, echoing. He scanned the terrain, heart rate unchanged, but his eyes sharpened. A patch of brush nearby had been trampled. Just beyond it, nestled behind a ring of stone, sat a dry well, its rotted wooden cover half collapsed. He approached, kneeling at the rim, peering into the shaft, his breath caught, just slightly. Down there, clutching a jagged rock wall with mud-streaked hands, was a little girl. Her dress was torn at the hem, her knees scraped raw, brown curls stuck to her face. She looked up, saw the silhouette of the man above, and froze, eyes wide with panic. Jackson said nothing. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a rope, and tied a tight loop. He tossed it down with practiced precision. "Hold on," he muttered, voice rough as worn leather. The girl's hands were trembling, but she grabbed the rope. Jackson braced himself against a stump and began to pull, slow and steady, like drawing a bucket full of something too precious to spill. Halfway up, the girl slipped. A small scream tore from her throat. Jackson grunted, tightened his grip, and held fast. His forearms strained beneath his coat, jaw clenched. Inch by inch, she rose until he could reach her. He grabbed her under the arms and lifted. She weighed nothing. He set her down on the grass, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The girl was filthy, mud in her lashes, blood on her elbows. She coughed, wiped her mouth with a trembling hand, then looked up at the man who had pulled her from the dark. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat. The scar on his left cheek twisted slightly as he breathed. His hands, massive and calloused, hung motionless by his sides. He said nothing, did nothing. But she stared at him, long and hard, as if trying to see beneath the silence. And then, her little voice rose, hoarse and soft, almost like a prayer. "You need a wife," she said. He blinked. She tilted her head, eyes still locked on his. "And I need a dad." Jackson Clay didn't move. Not at first. Not when the wind rustled through the grass. Not when his gelding let out a low, questioning snort behind him. Not when the chill of morning slipped beneath his collar. But something in his chest stirred, a flicker, a fault line, a soundless cracking beneath the ribs. His eyes, weathered and dry from years of dust and loss, grew wet. And for the first time in a long, long while, it wasn't the wind that made them so. Later that morning, the town of Sable Ridge unfolded like a memory half forgotten, weathered wood storefronts leaning into the wind, horses tied at crooked rails, and the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer keeping time with the heartbeat of the West. It was not much, but to Mara Jennings, it was far enough. She stood at the edge of the main street, boots dust-caked and skirt hem torn from the long ride through the night. Her daughter, Ellie, had fallen asleep in the saddle hours before, cradled against her chest like a fragile prayer. Mara had not slept in days. 28, But looking older by heartache alone, Mara carried the kind of weariness that no sleep could fix. Her face, once soft and sun-kissed, now bore lines from too many silences and too few safe places. Her eyes, icy blue and unblinking, had learned to scan every shadow. They missed nothing, trusted no one. She had once been a field nurse, tending to bleeding men in makeshift tents while the war ripped the country in two. Her hands had sewn more flesh than they had held warmth. Her husband, Corporal Samuel Rains, had died in the Battle of Spotsylvania, a good man with a gentle laugh. His death left her not only widowed but alone in a land that took more than it ever gave. After the war, she had nowhere to go. That was when Lyle Jennings came. Lyle had served with her husband. At first he offered shelter, then food, then protection. But that protection came at a price. His hands, his temper, his twisted sense of ownership. There was no wedding, no church, no vows, just bruises and silence. One night, with Ellie crying in the next room, Mara had looked at herself in a broken mirror, touched the cut on her cheek, and decided to run. And now here she was, Sable Ridge, a dot on a map, a hope on a breath. She tied her horse outside the mayor's office, gathered her shawl, and lifted Ellie, still groggy, into her arms. The child's weight was familiar, grounding. As she stepped onto the creaking porch of the office, her heart pounded louder than any knock could. But she never reached the door. Voices drifted around the side of the building. One was deep, gravel-lined like wagon wheels over stone. The other, her daughter's. Mara stepped into view, and time stopped. There, seated on the low steps behind the building, was Jackson Clay. He sat like a carved statue, legs bent, arms resting across his thighs. And beside him, barely reaching his elbow, sat Ellie, her face upturned, chattering quietly, her little hand resting on his massive knee like it had every right to be there. The sight nearly broke Mara in half. Jackson noticed her first. He turned his head slowly, not startled, but aware. His eyes met hers across the distance. They were not cruel eyes, nor were they kind. They were eyes that had endured. For a second, Mara forgot how to breathe. Then Ellie turned, saw her mother, and smiled. She leapt up and ran, arms outstretched. "Mama?" Mara knelt and caught her, burying her face in her daughter's curls. When she looked up again, Jackson had risen. He stood tall, hat in one hand, the other hand at his side like he did not know what to do with it. Mara rose slowly. Her voice trembled as much from exhaustion as from fear. "Thank you for saving her," she said, barely above a whisper. Her gaze couldn't meet his for more than a second at a time. I am her mother." Jackson nodded once. No words, just that quiet, unwavering presence, like a mountain that had decided to listen. And in that moment, Mara Jennings, runaway widow, weary stranger, mother on the edge, felt the strangest thing. For the first time in months, she did not feel afraid. They called him Giant Clay in town, not out of mockery but respect, the kind earned through silence and survival. Few knew his real name, even fewer his story. He lived up on the ridge, past the split cedar trail, in a cabin that leaned slightly west like it, too, had grown tired of standing. Jackson Clay had built that cabin with his own hands years ago, back when hope still had a heartbeat. Before the war, before the grave. He lived alone, no wife, no children, no dog, just a gray gelding, a hunting rifle, and a memory that refused to fade. The townsfolk had stopped asking questions after the first year. His presence was steady, unbothered, but not inviting. If a roof needed patching or a wagon lost a wheel, he might show up, say little, work hard, and disappear again before dusk. But in quiet corners, a few remembered. He had once worn the blue, a Union artillery captain, decorated for his skill with cannons and cursed for his silence off the field. His men called him the Wall, unbreakable under fire. But none of that mattered after what happened in Shiloh Ridge, 2 months after Appomattox. Jackson had taken leave, heading home to surprise his wife and their young daughter. The war was over. Or so they said. But the land was still bleeding, and justice had no compass. When he arrived, the cabin was in flames. It had been a mistake, the sheriff claimed. A rogue militia, half drunk, mistook his home for that of a Confederate sympathizer. By the time Jackson arrived, his family was already ash. He never raised a fist, never screamed. He buried them under the dogwood tree and walked away. From the army, from the country, from life, mostly. Until a little girl with muddy hands and a wildflower smile looked up at him from the bottom of a well. 2 days after he pulled Ellie out, he found something tucked under the saddle strap of his gelding, a handkerchief, small and soft, stitched with clumsy yellow petals. A daisy. He stared at it for a long time. The stitching was uneven. A child's work. He should have returned it. But he did not. Instead, he folded it carefully and placed it in a tin box beneath his bed, beside an old tintype photo of a woman with a sun hat and a child barely walking. The next morning, before dawn, he rode into town. He did not knock. He simply climbed onto the roof of Mara Jennings' rented cabin and began pulling up shingles. The leak was small, but the damage would spread by winter. He patched it with care, making sure the seams would hold. When he finished, he left before anyone woke. At sunrise, Mara opened her door and found a small sack of oats on the step, fresh, heavy, tied with a string. The next morning, it was flour. The next, dried apples. No note, no sound, just acts. Mara said nothing, but her eyes began to change. The deep blue frost she wore like armor started to thaw at the edges. She watched her roof with suspicion at first, then with wonder. She began leaving her porch light burning longer into the evening. One afternoon she caught sight of Jackson across the street. He tipped his hat barely. She gave a nod. That night, she sewed a patch on Ellie's torn sleeve and whispered, almost to herself, "He does not speak, but he says plenty." And up on the ridge, Jackson sat beside the fire, holding the daisy handkerchief in his palm like it might bloom again. The market bustled with life, if such a word could be used for a place like Sable Ridge. Once a month, traders came in from outlying ranches, bringing pelts, dried meat, herbs, and the kind of gossip that traveled faster than any horse. Tables lined the dusty street, covered in burlap and glass jars, and children darted between barrels of pickles and baskets of apples, sticky with sugar and joy. Mara Jennings stood behind a small wooden table covered with hand-rolled bandages, tonic bottles, and salves she had made from pine resin and willow bark. Her hands moved methodically, arranging her goods, but her eyes never stopped scanning. She always scanned. Ellie sat on a stool nearby, drawing in the dirt with a stick, her curls bouncing each time she glanced up to be sure her mother was still there. Mara smiled faintly, adjusting the price tag on a jar of cough syrup. The sun was warm, the breeze light. For a brief moment, she let herself imagine they were safe. And then the crowd shifted. A hush, the kind that rolls in like a storm cloud, unseen but felt. Mara's body stiffened before she even turned. He was there. Lyle Jennings. Hat low, spurs clinking, that crooked grin on his sunburnt face. 2 fingers hooked into the belt of his weathered trousers, just inches from the pistol at his hip. "Well now," he said, voice sweet as spoiled molasses, "ain't this a picture?" Mara reached for Ellie without thinking, pulling the child close. Lyle took a step forward. "Been looking for you two." "I told you to leave us alone," Mara said, voice flat but trembling beneath. "You told me a lot of things. None of 'em matter now." He glanced at the jars, the table, the pathetic attempt at a new life. "You think selling root water and Band-Aids makes you free?" Ellie whimpered and broke away, running, not toward her mother, but toward the edge of the market. Toward him. Jackson Clay stood near the leather goods stall, coiled lariat in hand, inspecting a worn bridle. He looked up just as Ellie slammed into his leg, hiding behind him like she had done it 1,000 times. His eyes rose. Lyle had followed, now 15 paces away, His hand twitched near his belt. Jackson turned fully, placing himself between the girl and the man, his frame blocking out the Sunday. Lyle stopped short. Jackson did not speak. He did not draw. He only looked. And for a man like Lyle, used to yelling, to fists, to fear, that look was worse than a bullet. The market had gone silent. Every trader, every child, every animal stood still. Mara pushed through the crowd, breath ragged, eyes wide. She reached Jackson and Ellie just as Lyle took another step. Jackson raised a hand. Just one. It hovered in the air like a mountain ready to fall. Lyle hesitated. He looked into the face of the man they called Giant Clay. The rumors were true. Those eyes held the weight of death, not threat, but certainty. Lyle's grin faltered. "Fine," he spat, backing up, rage and shame battling in his veins. "But she's still mine. You can't keep her forever." "No," Jackson said at last, voice low as thunder. "But I can keep you away." Lyle cursed, spun on his heel, and disappeared into the crowd. Silence lingered a beat longer, then shattered as voices returned, people pretending not to have watched what they could not forget. Mara fell to her knees and gathered Ellie into her arms. The little girl clung to her mother but looked back at Jackson with wide, grateful eyes. Jackson knelt, pulled a clean handkerchief from his coat pocket, and gently dabbed the dirt and tears from Ellie's cheek. Then, standing slowly, he turned to Mara. Without a word, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. He handed it to her. She unwrapped it carefully. It was Ellie's daisy-stitched handkerchief, washed, folded perfectly, pressed flat. Mara looked up, stunned. "You kept it?" Jackson nodded once. Her eyes welled up. This time, she did not fight the tears. She let them fall. The forge rang out with the hammer's rhythm, iron striking iron, sparks flaring like angry fireflies in the dusk. Old Jed Harlan, the blacksmith of Sable Ridge, paused mid-swing as Jackson Clay stepped into the shop. Jackson was there for horseshoe nails, that was all. But Jed squinted through the rising heat, leaned forward and frowned. "I know you." Jackson didn't respond. He laid a coin on the anvil and turned to go. "You wore blue," Jed said louder this time. "Shiloh, Gettysburg. You're Clay, Captain Jackson Clay of the 4th Artillery." The silence that followed was colder than the air outside. Jackson didn't deny it. He simply walked out, the door swinging shut behind him with a creak that sounded far too loud. Within the hour, the story had traveled down every porch, across every whiskey glass, into every wary heart that still carried the ghosts of war. Though the conflict had ended over a decade ago, the scars were fresh for many, and for some, they bled still. It reached Mara by evening. She was sorting herbs in her small kitchen when Mrs. Calhoun, the preacher's wife, whispered it over the fence like passing poison. By nightfall, Mara sat in silence beside the hearth, Ellie asleep in the next room, unaware that her mother's world had tilted once again. Her husband had died wearing gray. And now the man who had saved her daughter, the man who had started to chip away the stone around her heart, had worn blue. She did not sleep. By dawn, she was climbing the ridge trail. Jackson was splitting wood when she arrived. He saw her silhouette through the trees, straight-backed, stubborn, storm-eyed. He wiped his hands, tossed the axe aside, and waited. "You fought for the North," Mara said flatly. He nodded. "My husband died at Spotsylvania, shot through the lung, died choking on his own blood." Jackson said nothing. He watched her like a man watches lightning, never knowing if it would burn or bless. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, voice shaking. Jackson turned, stepped into the cabin, and returned moments later with a small, battered wooden box. He held it out. Mara hesitated, then took it. Inside lay a Union officer's badge, tarnished but intact, beside a folded envelope, its edges frayed with time. She looked up. "My wife's," he said. Mara opened the letter with trembling fingers. The ink had faded, but the handwriting, elegant and full of love, still danced across the page. My dearest Jack, if you read this, then I am gone. Please do not find the men who did this. Do not let vengeance claim you. I want you to live, my love. Live long enough to remember joy, to laugh again, love again. Because I know your heart, it is still soft as moonlight, no matter how much blood it has seen. Mara folded the letter slowly, hands trembling. Her throat tightened. She looked at Jackson, and for a moment she saw not a soldier, not a giant, not a myth, but a man, a grieving man, a man still breathing through the ashes of a life burned down. She closed the box, held it to her chest. But then, the weight of her own memories pressed in. Samuel's laugh, his warm hands, the blood that soaked through her dress the day she was handed his final letter. She looked away. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I cannot, not yet." Jackson's face did not fall. He simply nodded, as if he had expected it, as if he understood better than anyone that healing does not always come with kindness. It often comes with time. Mara stepped back, tears stinging her eyes. "I need to protect my daughter from any more ghosts, even gentle ones." She turned, walked down the trail, never looking back. And Jackson Clay stood in the doorway of his cabin, the box still warm from her hands, watching her disappear once more into the fog. And for the second time in his life, he let someone go. The house was dark, except for the flicker of a dying lamp. Mara stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the packed saddlebags by the door. Her coat hung on the peg, her heart already halfway out the door. Ellie sat on the edge of the bed, her small hands gripping the blanket. "Do we have to go?" she whispered. Mara didn't answer. "You said we'd stay if it was safe." "He made it safe." "I know," Mara said softly, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "But sometimes, it's not that simple." Ellie sniffled. "It is to me." Mara knelt and pulled her daughter into a hug. "Go to sleep, we ride at first light." Ellie nodded, but her eyes didn't close. They stayed open long after Mara blew out the lamp, long after the silence thickened. And when she was sure her mother had fallen asleep, Ellie rose quietly. She put on her boots, grabbed her little shawl, and slipped out the door. The night was bitter. Cold air bit her cheeks and turned her breath to smoke. But she walked with purpose, hugging her arms to her chest, tiny boots crunching the frost-covered grass. The trail to Jackson's cabin was longer in the dark. Trees loomed like giants, but she kept walking. She knew the way. Jackson stirred when the wind shifted. A feeling, not sound, pulled him from his half-sleep. He rose, grabbed his rifle by instinct, and moved to the door. He opened it and looked down. There, curled up on his welcome mat, was Ellie. Her lips were blue, hands tucked beneath her chin, body shivering. Jackson dropped the rifle. In one swift motion, he scooped her into his arms, carried her inside, and placed her on the cot near the fire. He stoked the embers, added 2 fresh logs, then wrapped her in every blanket he owned. Her eyes fluttered open. "I found you," she murmured. He sat beside her, unsure what to say. Words were still foreign to him in moments like these. "Why?" he asked finally. Ellie yawned. "Because you don't leave people who hold you like you're precious." He swallowed hard, looked away. "I had a daughter," he said after a moment. The words cracked as they left his throat. Her name was June. Ellie looked at him, eyes wide and listening. She used to sing to the horses, even when they were mean. She wasn't afraid of anything. He smiled faintly, staring into the fire. "One time, she fell asleep in the hayloft, and I couldn't find her for hours. When I did, she just looked up and said, 'I was dreaming of clouds, Papa.'" Jackson's voice broke then. "Just a little, enough." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Ellie reached out and took his rough, calloused fingers in her tiny ones. "Did she know you loved her?" Jackson nodded, voice hoarse. "Every day." Ellie snuggled closer beneath the blankets. "Then she's still with you?" He did not answer. He just sat there, the fire casting soft light on a man who had not let himself feel for too long. And then, at the edge of the porch, a shadow moved. Mara stood just beyond the glow of the lantern, her face streaked with tears. She had woken to find Ellie gone, followed her tracks through the frost, heart pounding with fear. But now she stood frozen. Because through the window she saw him, this quiet giant, bent low beside her daughter, whispering stories with a voice that carried more ache than anger, more love than loss. He had not seen her. She could have turned and left. But she did not. She stayed. And for the first time, she saw not the soldier, not the badge, but the father he had once been, and the man he still might become. The air was too still. Jackson felt it before he saw it, an instinct honed from war and loss. Birds had stopped singing. Even the wind, so constant in the trees, held its breath. He stood on the porch, coffee mug in hand, eyes narrowed toward the tree line. Something was coming. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. Mara looked up from where she was brushing Ellie's hair. The fire crackled. Dinner simmered. "Go down to the cellar," Jackson said, voice calm but edged. Mara stiffened. "Why?" "Now." She didn't argue. The look in his eyes was enough. He moved aside a rug, opened the trapdoor to the old root cellar. Mara grabbed Ellie and descended. Jackson handed her a lantern and a rifle. "Do not come out," he said, "not until I come for you." Then he shut the hatch and rolled the rug back over it. 10 minutes later, Lyle Jennings arrived. He was not alone. 2 men rode in beside him, grim, armed to the teeth. Mercenaries, men who killed not for cause, but for coin. The cabin stood silent as they dismounted. Lyle spat. "I warned you, Clay. Thought you could steal what's mine and get away with it?" Jackson stepped out from the trees, not the cabin. He had circled around. A hawthorn branch snapped under his boot. He came into view, rifle in hand, hat low. "You have one chance," he said. "Turn around." Lyle laughed. "You're outgunned, old man." Jackson said nothing. Because he was never outsmarted. The first mercenary stepped forward, only to drop into a pit trap. A scream, a snapped leg. His gun clattered away. The second raised his rifle, but Jackson had already moved. A rope snapped. Logs rolled from above, slamming him into a tree. He did not get up. Only Lyle remained. Furious. Alone. He drew and fired. Jackson dove, rolled behind the water trough. A bullet grazed his arm. Blood bloomed. He returned fire, one shot, clipping Lyle's shoulder. The outlaw screamed, stumbled back. Then, silence. Smoke drifted through the trees. Embers from a cigar had caught the underbrush. The woods were burning. Jackson limped forward, bleeding, rifle raised. Lyle crawled, hatred in his eyes. "She was mine," he hissed. "You don't get to take what's mine." Jackson stood over him. "She was never yours," he said. "She was surviving you." Lyle reached for his fallen gun. Jackson kicked it aside. Behind him flames crept higher, snapping at pine boughs. He turned away, leaving Lyle in the dirt. By the time the townspeople arrived, drawn by smoke and shots, the forest edge burned, but the cabin stood untouched. And in front of it, like a monument of ash and blood, stood Jackson Clay. Shirt torn, one sleeve soaked in red. His hat hung at his side, his breath shallow, but he did not fall. He stood between the fire and the cabin, between danger and them. Mayor Calloway dismounted, eyes wide. "My God, Jackson, what happened?" Jackson didn't speak. He only nodded toward the trees, where Lyle lay unconscious, the mercenaries groaning in pain. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Mara stepped out, Ellie in her arms. She looked at him, bloodied, smoke curling behind him, shoulders heaving. And for the first time, she saw not just the man who had saved them, but the one who had nearly died for them, and still stood. Ellie lay bundled beneath quilts, cheeks flushed with fever, hair damp against her brow. Mara sat beside her, dabbing gently with a cool cloth, whispering lullabies from years gone by. Beside them, Jackson Clay sat silently in a chair pulled close to the bed, eyes never leaving the child's face. He had not moved in hours. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had stilled, as if the land itself held its breath. Ellie stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and slowly, her gaze found them. Her mother's tear-streaked eyes, and the weathered face of the giant she trusted from the beginning. She smiled faintly. "Are we staying here? Forever?" she whispered. Jackson reached for her hand. It was small but warm now, alive. He looked at Mara, voice low but steady. "Do I have your permission to build something that won't burn down this time?" Mara's breath caught, her lips trembled. She nodded, and the tears that fell were no longer from sorrow. They were the kind born of hope. 2 months later, spring kissed the valley green. The snows had melted, the earth breathed again. Jackson rebuilt the cabin from the ground up, not because it was broken, but because it deserved something new. He carved every beam by hand, smoothed each doorframe, and planted a garden near the riverbank where white birch trees reached for the sky. Mara filled the shelves with jars of herbs and weathered books. She sang while she worked, hummed hymns with the windows open. Ellie laughed. She ran through the fields, braids flying, rode a gentle mare Jackson had broken himself, and climbed trees with muddy feet and scraped knees. Their joy echoed across the hills. Even the crows paused to listen. When the wild flowers bloomed, they wed beneath the tallest birch on the land. No preacher, just the mayor, hat in hand, smile wide. The women of Sable Ridge had sewn Mara a simple white dress. It wasn't perfect, but it fit her like a promise. Jackson wore his best shirt, pressed as flat as he could. His hands shook as he buttoned the collar. Ellie stood between them, a wreath of daisies in her hair, petals in her pocket. She scattered flowers on the breeze, giggling. The ceremony was brief, but the moment would last forever. Jackson took Mara's hands. His voice, usually gruff, softened. "I thought I died in the war," he said. "I stopped breathing when the world burned down around me. But you and Ellie, you gave me air again, a reason to stay, and this time, I'm not going anywhere." Mara pressed her forehead to his, whispering through tears, "You gave us back the meaning of safe." Ellie hugged them both, squealing as they lifted her between them. The people cheered. No music, just hearts too full to be still. That evening, as the sun melted into gold, 3 horses rode across the open meadow. Jackson, Mara, and Ellie rode side by side, no destination, just together. Their laughter rose with the dust behind them. And as they disappeared into the horizon, the view widened, showing the little house by the river, smoke curling from its chimney, peaceful beneath the birch trees. A place not born of escape, but of choosing to stay. Sometimes, the heart finds its way home, not where it began, but where it chose to stay. From the ashes of war and the silence of sorrow, love returned, not through grand gestures, but quiet protection, and the trust of a child who saw a father in a giant's shadow. Jackson, Mara, and Ellie didn't just survive the Wild West. They built a life inside it. If this story touched your heart, hit like, share your favorite moment in the comments, and subscribe for more untamed, unforgettable love stories from the American frontier. This is Wild West Love Stories, where bullets missed, but hearts never did. See you in the next tale, partner.